Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to answer your listener questions for August of 2025, and we have some really interesting questions and some sort of specific and detailed questions that we'll go through today. And I guess some lessons learned, I think, here at the beginning. So it'll be interesting to dive into that as well. And it kind of ties into a few of the recent episodes that we've had related to online scams and protecting yourself. And so that is one thing we'll talk about here in a minute. But Justin, should we dive into this first question?
Yeah, let's do it, Matt. Yeah, this is an interesting question here and goes over some specific details that I think mineral owners run into quite often. So the first question here is from Stefan. Says, Matt, thanks for all you do for mineral owners. Thanks to you, I've joined Neuro and taken your online course and really educated myself. And I've come into an issue with an operator in Texas and have already started protesting via a letter from an attorney. Basically, operator permitted a horizontal well that included a track I had leased to them. They filed the original permit in August of 24 as a pooled unit. They then amended the permit that October, changing the acreage, which actually helped Stefan's interest in the well, but keeping it a pooled unit. Upon receiving division orders in December, I noticed that my net revenue and interest was listed at 0.00225 instead of my calculated 0.00385. I asked the division order analyst about the discrepancy, and she said they were calculating it as an allocation well. The plat included tracks that did not have any wellbore passing through them. I brought this to their attention, mentioning that as if those owners were getting paid based on acreage, then I wouldn't be paid that way too. He goes on to say 3 weeks later, in January 25, they filed another amended permit, dropping all of those tracks from the plat, but still listing the drilling unit as pooled, including a certificate of pooling authority. The well has been producing since November of 24, yet they have not filed a completion report. Stefan's wondering, do I have a legal argument to go after my net revenue interest as acreage in a pooled unit? It was his understanding that the purpose of the allocation well was to access minerals that cannot be pooled, or you have decided not to pool. How long can operators legally take to get their permits in order post-completion? And then can you actually drill an allocation well on a pooled unit? He goes on with a couple other questions, Matt, but I'll kind of let you address those first because I think it's kind of cause and effect for the last couple.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is a great question. And this is a topic that we actually did a deep dive in a webinar for NARO, the National Association of Royalty Owners. Jimmy Wright and I did a presentation on pooling in Texas and the difference between allocation wells and pooling and those types of things and how it affects the decimal interest in your wells, based on a few hypothetical examples that we provided in that presentation. So if you're a NARO member, you can find the links to that presentation under the members section. Just look for the webinars. If you're not a NARO member, we'll have a link in the show notes where you can get $25 off your first year's membership. And it's only $50 for your first year. So it's an amazing value for all the information and education that they offer. But back to the question, Stephen, I think you do have recourse, certainly based on what you described. If they have listed it as a pooled unit still after making those amendments, then I would go after them to, assuming the acreage is the same. I guess that's one thing, that if they removed the acreage from that, or if they added acreage and the pooled unit size changed, then your decimal interest calculation will have to change as well. So, make sure that you're double checking that and the latest information on the Railroad Commission website as far as the acreage in that pooled unit to make sure you're calculating it correctly. But I would start out, first of all, by going to the operator when you get the division order, following up with the division order analyst, stating your case as to why you think you have a different number. And it's possible that they made an error. Maybe they're using the old formulas based on the previous permit and that didn't get updated in the system, even though it was filed with the Railroad Commission. So all that is possible, but, certainly I would follow up and make sure that you're getting paid what you think you should get paid. And if there's an explanation, if they have a different number, still ask them for why. And then if you're still not satisfied with the answer, then you can get help from an expert to double check it, just to help you make sure that you're calculating it correctly. But yeah, this brings up an interesting point, because in Texas, there's not statutory pooling per se. There is, pooling legislation or pooling provisions, but they're not frequently used for as far as forced pooling. It's all voluntary pooling. And so what Stephen's mentioning is being voluntarily pooled in that. And in this case, it's beneficial to him. Now, there's other cases where it would go the other way. And actually, if you had an allocation well, you might have a higher net revenue interest in that well based on just the specific wellbore path relative to where you own minerals. And in other words, the wellbore would be going through more of the actual your mineral tract, and so you would get a higher proportional share of the royalties. And we'll link again in the show notes to some more information about allocation wells in Texas. What are they? What does that mean? But yeah, basically it can get very complicated very quickly when you deal with allocation wells. And so you just have to be careful in terms of how you're calculating that decimal interest. But yeah, I would continue to push for, based on how it's filed. And if you still think that you should be getting paid more, then I would follow up with the division order analyst, state your case and find out why. And then, if you're still not happy with it, again, get some help from an expert, perhaps an attorney, to help follow up with the operator to get you what you deserve. So yeah, good luck.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. Good luck on that. And remember, Stephen, it may be that the division order analyst has to work with some of the attorneys within the company. And sometimes that interface can take just a bit of time, but remain consistent. Talk with the division order analyst. Polite persistence really pays off in these kind of scenarios. So she'll push that ball forward if she needs to talk to somebody else, or if they need to talk to somebody else. All right, Matt. So our next one here is about a scam situation, which unfortunately we've been hearing about a lot lately. This one is from Tracy. Tracy says, "Good afternoon. My dad just told me about a scam related to his mineral rights, which he didn't realize was a scam until I guess he realized it was. It was too late. Is there anything he can do? He sent a notarized letter to the company, which now he can't get a hold of. Can you shed some light on this?" And Matt, again, this is an unfortunate scenario, and they seem to pop up in all types of different flavors. We talked about them in episode 219, how to avoid mineral rights and royalty scams, and then also episode 256, where we talked about the term royalty deed scam that was going around at the time. And these come in just all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear about that situation, Tracy. And I guess, without providing more information, it's hard for us to say, or brainstorm some ideas for you as to what recourse he might have. Just some thoughts in general, though, and I would definitely go back and listen to those 2 episodes that Justin mentioned, because we talk about a lot of those different scenarios and ways to protect yourself. But, if something, it was a scam, sounds like perhaps there was a fraudulent deed, or, they took more than what he thought he was giving or something. But either in that case, if there's a fraudulent deed, because that is something we talked about in our recent episode as well on cybersecurity tips and protecting yourself online. And there are actually a few counties and some websites that allow you to enter your property information, and it'll send you an alert within 24 hours after a deed is recorded with your name or against that property parcel number. And so that could be a good way to be notified if there's somebody that files a fraudulent deed. It doesn't happen super often, but it does happen. And, unfortunately, you have to get attorneys involved. You have to go through the process, and then, to get it reversed and to get it back in your name, and then to go after, the person that stole the property. Now, if there is something illegal that was done, then I would get with the state attorney general. I would send them a letter, and then, definitely get help with an attorney, and they can advise as to what your options are from a legal point of view. Hopefully that can get you back on the right track to reclaim that property. So another scam, let's call it, is that somebody says they're going to do something and they do something else, right? So maybe they claim that, we're only going to buy a portion of your interest, but the deed says that you're selling 100% of that. If you sign that deed, the onus is on you to make sure that it's correct before you sign any sort of legal document, because in that case, I'm not sure what kind of recourse you would have. Perhaps if there was something in writing that said that they were going to only acquire a certain amount for a certain price and you only got paid that lower amount, but they took 100% of the minerals, for example. That could be something, again, you would need something in writing. If it's just something where it's hearsay, if it's, he said that he was only going to purchase 25% of the minerals and pay us for that, and we were going to keep 75%, but the deed, you conveyed 100%. You unfortunately may or may not have recourse on that, just because, again, you'd have to prove, in writing that was the agreement and that they didn't hold up their end of the agreement. And so if you can't do that, you may be out of luck, unfortunately. But again, get with an attorney that's licensed in the state where the minerals are located, and they can help you navigate this and hopefully go after the person that took advantage of your dad. So yeah, good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Good luck, Tracy. And you said it, man. The attorney is going to be worth their weight in gold to kind of go over the options with you and ask you the specific questions that'll help them to understand what you might be able to do here. All right, Matt. So our next one here is from Kathy. Kathy says, I'm a mineral owner looking for a pathway to eliminate post-production costs as stated in my lease that have been charged since the inception of my royalty payments. And Matt, this always gets really interesting because there's a lot that goes into this. Sometimes the state dictates what can and can't be done. Sometimes the lease dictates, or oftentimes it's in the lease what can and can't be done. So this gets complicated.
Yeah, it gets complicated. And I will say that we do have an episode on correct royalty payments. We'll link to that in the show notes. But, it kind of goes back to what Justin said earlier about polite persistence pays. So I would contact the owner relations department, call them, do it in writing via email, perhaps a letter. Depending on what state it's in, there are certain rights you have under the law. Review that and make sure that you're following those steps to protect those rights. So if you're getting paid incorrectly, so you may have recourse on interest payments. So for late royalties, basically, because they underpaid you. So that is something to look into. But yeah, certainly if your lease has very clearly stated and correctly stated language that you have a cost-free lease, in other words, they're not allowed to deduct any post-production costs. And so what we mean by post-production costs are things like transportation, compression, marketing. And this all generally relates to natural gas, because when it comes out of the wellhead, gas needs to be processed in order to be sold as natural gas. And then if there's any natural gas liquids associated with that, for those to be stripped out and sold as natural gas liquids. And so a lot of times if your lease is silent to that, and depending on the statute, and if again, like Justin said, if the state allows for operators to pass those costs on to the royalty owners, then you might be footing part of the bill for those things. And it can be a significant portion of your gas royalties. So in this case, I would say, really need to look at your lease, perhaps get help from an attorney to help you review that to make sure that you truly, should not be getting charged those post-production costs. Sometimes, depending on how the lease is worded, if you didn't use the right language, you may have thought that you had no post-production costs were allowed, but actually they were. So you just got to be careful, because certain words placed in certain spots in those clauses can make a big difference as to what's allowed or what's not allowed. But definitely get help from an attorney to navigate that. And again, if they are incorrectly charging those, get with the operator, notify them, in writing again, and then ask that you're paid any of the underpayment and along with any interest. And then, again, just be persistent. And if you need to, get an attorney involved. So good luck, Kathy.
Yep, absolutely. Good luck, Kathy. And one of the things you can certainly do, Kathy, if you do reach out to an attorney, is put all the information together. Get all of the payments, all of the records, have those ready to go. Oftentimes for attorneys in this scenario, we've talked to Spencer Cox quite a bit in this area, and it's a very time-consuming process to put this information together, to reconcile it, to compare it. So, Kathy, if you're able to put that together yourself and then go to an attorney, it'll really help things because they can make the case, they can double-check your information and really do what they do best, which is give you legal advice. All right, Matt. So our next one here, this is really kind of an interesting question and asked in an interesting way. They say, greetings, Matt and Justin. As a longtime listener of the Mineral Rights Podcast ever since 2013, I've greatly appreciated your insight into facets of mineral ownership, a lot of which I wasn't even aware of. She goes on to say that my question may pertain for those landowners who have currently non-producing but leased acreage on the edges of a major play, such as the Midland Basin. I've been approached by buyers, and while I've been rejecting their offers, I am mindful of the fact that not all shale acreage, indeed not all oil operators, are the same, which leads me to my question. When would non-producing leased minerals attain their most value? Would it peak when the drilling permits were filed for that acreage, then possibly go up or down based on the well results? I don't want to hold on thinking it'll be a spindle top only for it to be a bust. And so, Matt, she's basically she's in a situation to where they're not necessarily producing on her land, but her land was included in the lease that the operator did, and essentially asking, how does that affect it? And we've talked a lot about nearby activity, and I'm sure this kind of plays into that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I just looked, and the email was sent by, I think you pronounce it Caesura. So thank you for your email. Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, this gets into a topic that I had a conversation with a client recently about, a similar situation where they were thinking about selling. They had some offers, and it was acreage that was in the Permian Basin. It was kind of the same kind of thing. It was maybe had one vertical well on it or something, but it was on the edge of where they're doing horizontal drilling. And so the question was, well, I'm thinking about selling, and then we had this conversation, about when a property has the value at its peak. And like you're saying, Caesura, you've hit the nail on the head, is that it peaks right when the drilling permits, around that time when the drilling permits were filed for the acreage, really peaks when those wells have been drilled and completed, but not started producing yet. Because if you think about it from a mineral buyer's perspective, they're wanting a quick return on their investment, and it's based on the time value of money, right? So if they pay you a lump sum today, but it's going to take 5 years before they start receiving royalties to pay back that investment, the amount that they're going to be willing to offer you is going to be less, just again because of the time value money, right? They're foregoing investing in other types of things because they're paying you the money to buy your property. So they're factoring in a certain interest rate, basically, which will make that amount smaller today as compared to what the expected value is in the future. Now, in that case, where a well were just drilled and completed, it's getting ready to produce, division orders are going to get sent out quickly. In that case, the value is going to be at its peak because basically as soon as they close on that deal, they'll receive the initial royalty payments. They'll start paying back that investment quickly. That time value money factor is very small. And so you would get closer to the value of that property over time. At the end of the day, though, if you were to hold on to minerals and have all the wells get drilled and receive all the royalties over the life of those wells, by holding on to it, not taking into account the time value of money or certain target return on investment, you're going to receive more over the life of those wells just by holding on to that property than by selling. That said, there is a risk, right? So in your case where you're on the edge of a major play and, let's say it's in a good county, but maybe not where the heat of most of the activity is. In that case, you're trading off the risk that no additional wells get drilled on your property, at least, in your lifetime or in the foreseeable future, for a lump sum today that you get some value. So from that standpoint, that is the trade-off. And then the other thing, you don't have to sell 100%. So if you did want to lock in, if you get some, good value, good offers, and you do want to sell a portion, that is always on the table. So if you say, well, I'm going to sell half of my interest, I'm going to hold on and see what happens with the rest, that is another option that you can then, cash in some chips, so to speak, and get some value today, reinvest that in some other thing that is maybe a little bit more predictable, and then hold on to the minerals in case those wells are, a spindle top type situation, right? That they are actually good producing wells and that you get good royalty checks in the future. So that's always an option as well. But whatever you decide, I think it's helpful to get a professional valuation or appraisal to understand what the property's worth to help you negotiate the best value, the closest to the fair market value as possible. Again, if you're armed with that information, you'll be armed with the same type of information that those mineral buyers have, and it just evens the playing field. So that is something I provide, those types of services, but you can go to other qualified folks as well. That's something to consider before you make that decision to sell or not to sell, because you don't really know if you're getting an amount, unless you have an understanding of what the property's worth before that.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And it can take a lot of industry information to understand. And then it's some speculation because, these operators, we don't always know what they're going to do, but you have a good idea based on their past activity, which I've always amazed by how predictable it really is. Even when somebody from the outside like myself, we don't think we can really guess it. All right, Matt. So our next one from Linda is, how can I find out if I have any oil royalties? And Linda, I know a good place to start. A lot of people find out about this through inheritance, through being contacted by an operator, or through searching the unclaimed funds, either for your name or for one of your ancestors' names.
Yeah, those are all great places to start. So we'll link to those episodes in the show notes where we talk about how to find unclaimed royalties. And then, the other thing is learning how to perform a title search. So if you know where your ancestors owned property, maybe where you had ancestors that had homesteaded the land or, were granted the land by the government originally in a particular state. You can search across multiple counties. A lot of times there's websites like, for example, Oklahoma, there's OK County Records. Texas, there's texasfile.com and things like that you can search across multiple counties using those ancestors' names to see where they owned property, what kind of hits you get on that. And then you have to just sort of follow the rabbit hole, follow the trail down the rabbit hole, so to speak, to find out exactly what tracks, were there mineral rights involved or not, or did they just own the surface rights? Did they sell the minerals? Did they hold on to them? Oftentimes, like Justin said, if the property was not producing at a given time, might have gotten forgotten and not passed down correctly. It didn't go through probate and it didn't get deeded to the next generation. And so in that case, you have to go back and build the case that you're the rightful heir and then go through reopening that probate or file a determination of heirship to get the property deeded over to your name so that you show up as the rightful owner in the county records. So that would be the general process, but it's kind of like finding a needle in the haystack if you don't really know where to start. So again, using genealogy resources is a good place to start, just to try to figure out where they lived, where they owned property, and then kind of from there you can look at the counties and then search those county clerk and recorder websites, hopefully online, and try to see if there was anything out there that you might have an interest in mineral rights and oil and gas wells.
Yep, you said it, Matt. You got to follow the clues and do the research. All right, Matt. So our next one here is a pretty complicated one. So I'm going to dive into this. So the next one here is from Julie. Julie says, could you explain how the ownership interest and the division of interest works? She goes on to say we had an oil and gas interest in wells operated by various companies. And most recently, Devon took over. These companies had provisions in the leases that the parties entered into that prohibited the lessee from taking deductions for post-production costs such as processing, transportation, severance, and other taxes, etc. Grayson began operating the wells effective 1/1/2023, and then Devon Williston recently acquired Grayson. And she goes on to say that it seems like her decimal interest and the disbursement interest have recently significantly changed. Could the deduction language in the lease cause a change to the division of interest decimal? Can you tell me more about how the two interests are calculated? She goes on to say she provided copies of the lease, and that she has reached out to the company asking for an explanation, but hasn't gotten any information back. And then that one company agreed to comply after they took ownership. So prior years of failure to comply were not included. And this is in North Dakota, Matt. She also asked for who the North Dakota NAR representative was, which is smart on her part because they would be a great person that would be in the know in that area.
Those are all good questions, Julie. And I will say, that kind of starting out, the concept of the ownership interest and division of interest, I mean, we're kind of using those interchangeably usually. So that's generally the net revenue interest is kind of how we, I guess, the technical term. But essentially what that number should represent is your proportional share of the royalties that you're owed. Again, based on where your minerals are located, your lease royalty rate, and then the area that is pulled together that they're producing from. In North Dakota, those are typically 1,280 acre and sometimes larger now, longer lateral lengths mean that there is more acreage that's pooled together, but that is the number of acres that would be in your unit. So a couple of things. So you mentioned that you had a certain decimal interest in those wells, and then they changed operators, but then the division of interest or that decimal interest changed. And that's a red flag to me that they didn't load your information correctly. And so that's the first thing I would notify them that, here's what I think my decimal interest in those wells should be. Here's why, please correct that, or please tell me how you came up with this different number. And sometimes they make mistakes and they'll go in and fix it, and then you'll get that corrected, and they'll pay you what they shorted you in those underpayments, and then they'll pay correctly going forward. Now, the other thing is that when different operators take over wells, their title attorneys may have a different interpretation of a deed or a lease. And so it could be that they looked at the title report, the title opinion, and they said, well, actually, no, we think that this should have been handled differently, or maybe there was case law that came down differently since that original division order was signed and division of interest was calculated that affected your particular interest in those wells. All of that should be something that the company can explain and give you documentation and information as to why that decimal interest changed significantly. Again, absent a sale of a portion of your interest or something like that, it should be the same, right? When all it is that a new operator takes over those existing wells, your decimal interest should be the same. And that's the first thing to check when you get your first royalty check or you get a division order from the new operators, that those match. And if they don't, again, those are the things that I would do to notify them and to try to get that corrected. And then from the standpoint of the statute of limitations, I would go back to those prior companies if they still exist. So there is, like you said in your email, you mentioned a 10-year statute of limitation. I don't know off the top of my head from North Dakota, but just saying that assuming it is 10 years, you would need to go back to those prior operators that had owed you those funds and ask them to reimburse you for the underpayment. And then, again, North Dakota has pretty clear statutes as to what your rights are as a royalty owner. So definitely read that and make sure you're following those steps. And then they also have an ombudsman program. So it's a neutral third party that can help resolve disputes between royalty owners and producers. And so you'll find out information on that on the North Dakota Oil and Gas Commission website. And so that'll have some information on how to contact that person. You can provide the documentation and hopefully get them to help resolve it. And that might help get it over the line a little bit quicker, getting them involved. And then finally, depending on when you're listening to this, each year we have elections for officers for the state chapters of NARO, the National Association of Royalty Owners. But as of August 2025, when we're recording this, our representative is Cash Lund, and you can find information about the North Dakota chapter on the NARO website, which is naro-us.org. And on there's an email address you can email to ask questions or to get some more specific guidance, or maybe a referral to an attorney in North Dakota that can help you out. So yeah, good luck, and hopefully you can get that resolved quickly.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. That can get to be a complicated one, but certainly can be figured out. Just got to stay persistent. Our next one here, Matt, is from Nancy. Nancy says, I'm going to need an appraisal according to my accountant. Hopefully we don't have to pay 100% capital gains. I would like some more information on how to approach this. I'll gather the info concerning the legal description, along with the amount we got for selling our right to them. And Matt, this is such a common scenario that folks go through. If you inherited this property and you really don't have a cost basis to go off of, and you sell this property, you're paying capital gains tax from zero to whatever you sold the property for, which is certainly not ideal.
Yeah, it's certainly not ideal. And, I think you're on the right track, Nancy. If you can get a step up in basis is what your accountant is referring to. And that's basically where you get an appraisal to figure out what the property was worth when you inherited it. And then that becomes your basis. So like Justin said, you don't have to pay capital gains taxes on 100% of the proceeds of the sale. You would subtract your basis from that. So for example, let's say you sold your minerals for $100,000. The property was worth $50,000 when you inherited it. Well, then you would only owe taxes on the $50,000 gain. That's the $100,000 minus the $50,000 basis. And so that could save you a significant amount of money, of course. And so obviously if you can claim a step up in basis, it's oftentimes will be a good financial thing to do. Again, worked with Nancy on this. Unfortunately, in her case, she inherited this property in 1988, and the cost of the appraisal to get the step up in basis would have been more than she would save in taxes as compared to just claiming a $0 basis. And so that was my guidance to her. But that's something that an appraiser can give you a back of the napkin estimate as to the cost for that, what they call a retrospective appraisal. In other words, we're looking back to 1988 and then doing the valuation as of 1988. And so that is something that an appraiser can take a look at that for you and see if it's worth to actually go through the process of getting an appraisal. It's not inexpensive to get an IRS appraisal just because the level of documentation that's required. You have a formal report, you have all of the exhibits and all of the descriptions and all the research that goes into it, so that if you get audited, you can not have to get penalized or have any issues with that. They'll say, okay, that looks reasonable, looks legitimate, and then they'll move on and you'll get your, you won't have to file an adjustment to your tax return or anything. So that is something to consider, but they can give you an estimate for the appraisal based on the amount of properties that are involved, and again, give you a rough back of the napkin. Okay, back in that time period, it probably would have been, here's the most likely development scenario, and here's the value based on that, and then is that going to save you more in taxes than you'd pay for the appraisal? Then if so, then it would make sense to do it. If not, they should tell you, no, just go ahead and claim a zero basis. Unfortunately, it's going to cost more to get the appraisal done than you would save in taxes, but that is a pretty quick and easy calculation to do.
Yeah. And again, this is all too common, something that a lot of folks have to go through. And it sounds like your accountant thinks it'd be advantageous for you. So good job on what you know so far, and good luck getting that finished out. Our next one here, Matt, is from Tim. Tim says, I have a question. I'm asking for more money per acreage. Their second reply is that they're at the max they're paying, and I feel it should be a lot more because of the other mineral rights I have in that area are doing great. If I don't sign the division order, what happens now? Do they still have the right to drill, and I totally miss out on royalties? Should I accept the last offer? And he goes on to say, sorry for all the questions, but these are all the right questions, Matt.
Yeah, it's a great question. And based on what you're talking about, it's kind of hard to understand what phase in your journey you're in. Are you at the leasing on this particular tract, and they're offering you a certain amount of money, I assume, for the lease and lease bonus? So here's the thing. When you lease mineral rights, the lease bonus is great, and that represents the rent. Basically, they're paying upfront to lease the minerals for the primary term. So that could be 3 years, could be 2 years, could be 5 years, whatever that primary term is. And they're giving you a lump sum up front, and then they have the right to explore and drill in that primary term. And if they do drill a successful well, it extends into the secondary term, it holds the lease, and it's held by production at that point, and you get paid royalties based on the negotiated lease royalty rate. That lease bonus is amazing. It's always a great thing when you get paid a nice chunk of change up front, but don't shoot yourself in the foot by agreeing to a suboptimal or a low royalty rate just to maximize your lease bonus up front. Because what happens when you do that is you're directly affecting the value of those minerals. So if I were a mineral buyer and I was looking at your property and it was leased at a 25% royalty versus a 12.5% royalty, well, that property is worth twice as much at a 25% royalty. So you're actually immediately cutting the property value in half if you agree to a 12.5% royalty just to get a higher lease bonus. You really need to understand, what the value is associated with those future royalty payments versus the upfront lease bonus amount. And oftentimes, if you accept a higher lease bonus and a lower royalty rate, you're going to end up getting less money overall over the life of that property. Just in terms of lower royalty rates means that you'll get lower royalty payments. Royalty checks will be smaller. So, it pays to have the long view in that case and really negotiate for the best royalty rate and no post-production costs, as well. So including language that prohibits them from deducting those post-production costs, like we mentioned earlier. So those are a couple of things to think about, before you do sign And depending on which state you're in, if you are force pooled, like Oklahoma in particular, it oftentimes pays to wait and see what the best offer is, because ultimately what they're required to do when they file the pooling application is make the best offer based on what they've offered other mineral owners in that unit. And then in that case, you can elect to pick the option that, gives you the right balance between the lease bonus and the lease royalty rate, again, based on the best offers that have been made to other mineral owners in that area. So that can be a great strategy, is oftentimes, waiting. Or again, if you're not happy with the offer from the company that originally contacted you, do some research in the county clerk and recorder's website, find out who else is leasing minerals in that county and approach them and see if they are willing to lease your minerals for, a better royalty rate or whatever term that you're most interested in. So yeah, I would do that before I would just accept their last offer, because it is a business negotiation. So you definitely want to negotiate.
You said it, Matt. And then let's say that he just doesn't sign the division order. What happens then, right? Depending on the state, I know it's slightly different, but he certainly can't hold up drilling for all the mineral owners.
That's right. Yeah. So you would not be holding it out. They would still have the right to drill. Again, if they have a valid lease, or if they force pool you, right? So you may elect to not do that and get forced pooled. Well, then they're going to move forward and drill the well, and you wouldn't miss out on all the royalties, but you'll get the statutory minimum royalty rate, and then you'll back into a non-operated working interest after that well reaches payout, which may or may not be the best option for you. So again, that's where, reviewing that, usually I would say for most people, it makes most sense to sign a lease and get paid royalties and try to maximize the royalty side of things. But yeah, your mileage may vary. Get help from an expert, get help from your attorney before you sign any legal document, including oil and gas leases, things like that. So yeah, and then depending on the state, you may or may not even need to sign the division order. Texas, you do before they'll pay you. So they'll put it in suspense if you don't return a signed division order. But in pretty much all the other states, you can get the division order, just hold on to it, not sign it, and then they'll eventually send you the royalty checks when the well starts producing, just because it's not required by law. So again, just your state may vary, but it just really depends on where the minerals are located.
Yeah, it varies slightly, Matt, based on the state, and each state handles it just a little bit different. Well, Matt, that wraps up our listener questions that we have. And I'm sure we have lots more to go through.
Yeah, we're still just breaking through the list. We're into mid-February right now. So thank you for your patience, for everyone that has submitted a question. And if you have a question you'd like us to answer, send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. We read every one of them. We appreciate all the feedback that you provide. And, again, we're happy to answer your questions, and we'll do so as quickly as we can. But yeah, thanks again for your patience, and thanks for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.